So, to continue.
Continue. Part
Whenever
two.
I came across an abuse, I complained verbally to the local officials,
Yeah,
and I wrote a written report to my boss,
yeah,
whether it was in Kuala Lumpur or Manila or Jakarta
yes,
or Islamabad in Pakistan. And that's what the government hated that, the central government,
yeah.
because it was on record, in writing. And that's why only the Philippines never tried to get me out, but the Malaysians did, and the Indonesians did,
Mm-hmm.
and the Pakistanis did. They didn't like me. They wanted me to get out because I put the truth in front of their face.
Yeah, the
And they
emperor
couldn't stand it.
Yeah,
They couldn't stand to look at the truth of their own corruption
right.
and abuse. Okay, so this is the main idea about refugees: protection,
Yes,
whether it's life and death protection or making sure they're treated as human beings.
mm-hmm.
Now, what else do you want to know?
But that is the purpose for the UNHCR send you
Yes,
to the
but
rescue.
people interpret that differently.
Mm-hmm.
Okay,
Yeah,
there are other UN people who are my colleagues who would never criticize the government.
mm.
Oh, no, we must work with the government. We must not criticize the government. And I say, you criticize whoever is doing something wrong, whether it's the government or a non-government organization or whoever it is.
Mm.
It's not, but they will say, oh, no, we can't criticize the government. So there are different interpretations. You know, our protection, they say, is done through the government, and therefore we can't criticize the government. Well, I just couldn't accept that, when it was the government who was abusing them.
Yeah,
That is, abusing their protection. But at any rate, there are different interpretations of what you mean, what you do to protect the
to
refugees.
protect the refugees. Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I'm from Galang. What I am the most interested about the time you were in Galang. I know that you were there in 83 to 86.
That late 83 to early 86, that's right.
Yeah,
When I came to Galang, I was in charge of the UN office. That was a bit controversial to start with, but they named me in charge. I accepted the position, and that means I had to accept the responsibility as well.
yes,
And what did we have? I mean, when I was in Malaysia, at first I was an education officer, and I had about 30 people working under me in the
Education officer, yes.
as an education officer. And then I became a field officer and was in charge of the camp of Pulau Bidong.
yes.
And I had many more than 30.
Huh.
And responsibility for the whole camp was very different, very, very difficult. Anyhow, when I got to Galang, one of the most difficult things about Galang is that refugees arrive all over the different islands.
Yeah,
Okay, and I went out once on the boat to Kuku, the main island, to collect the refugees.
Kuku is belong to Indonesia.
Yes.
Yeah,
Well, I'm saying the refugees arrive on many different Indonesian islands.
right.
Okay, and so they have to be sent to Galang,
Yeah,
which means that you have to somehow or another help them where they are when they arrive.
yeah,
So the help is spread out
Spread out.
tremendously.
yes.
So that's very difficult. But we had a system, my predecessors worked out a system that worked fairly well.
Yes,
Not perfect, but at least not causing people to die, to suffer and die unnecessarily. Some did die. Some who came to Galang had a terrible trip
yeah.
and were half dead by the time they got there.
Hmm.
Yes. And so we have a fairly big cemetery in Galang.
Right.
Yes. It was a bit different in Malaysia, but also in the Philippines. They were to get to the Philippines was even worse than Galang.
Really?
Yes, much harder, much farther.
Yeah.
So yes, that was but my predecessors had done a good job in setting up a way of dealing with that situation. So I had maybe altogether about 30 people, both international officers and local officers. And it was a very good team, really a very good team. And both the international officers and the local officers were really excellent, really excellent. I had to decide, because when you're working for the UN with Galang, the UN office is on another island in Tanjung Pinang.
That's right. So you have
And the camp is on another island, Pulau Galang. So you had to go back and forth. I had to regularly check in at the office to get messages from Jakarta, to work out things with the local officials, the Navy and so on. The Navy was the one that was mainly involved, the Indonesian Navy. And so I had to spend time in Tanjung Pinang, but I decided that I would spend as much time as possible in Galang.
because of the security or safety. Why
Why what?
Why don't they let you stay in the camp with the refugee?
It's not that they didn't let me stay. I needed to come to the government people who were officially in charge,
Yeah.
above the ones in the camp,
Uh-huh.
were in Tanjung Pinang.
In Tanjung Pinang, I know that.
All right, and there was contact with Jakarta, not from Galang, but from Tanjung Pinang. So I had to, we had to have an office there, and so that was my official office. And Galang was where the camp was. Now many of my friends, and the fellow who took over after me, almost never went to Galang. He stayed in the Tanjung Pinang all the time. That was his idea. But I decided that I wanted to spend as much time as possible, and I ended up spending about 60% of my time in Galang,
In Galang, yeah.
and about 40% in Tanjung Pinang. Yes, the situation there was not easy. Corruption was always a danger.
At the time.
Corruption in Indonesia has been a danger for centuries, so it's nothing new.
Okay.
And it was nothing, and so we knew that it was going to happen.
Yeah.
It happens all throughout the country. Okay, I've traveled in Indonesia. I know that. I knew that before I came there.
Okay.
So that's one of the reasons I decided to stay in Galang. And there were problems. They had terrible food. The food they were providing when I came, this dried fish, was terrible, and the people hated it.
It's a plastic bag. They call B.
Yes.
3V. Yeah.
Yeah. And the people complained always about it.
Wow.
So I finally got them to change,
Upgraded.
to upgrade.
Yes.
Yeah. They weren't happy to do it because the contractors who provided the food were making more money off the fish.
Yep.
Yeah. So it's always money always comes into it.
Money.
Yes. Anyhow, I try to provide in the Galang camp, which was the first camp that I was really in charge of. I tried to provide a more relaxed situation.
Yeah.
And so there were some refugees who came who were classical musicians.
Classical music.
Classical musicians. The wife was a wonderful soprano, and the husband was a classical guitarist.
Yeah.
And I arranged for them to give concerts in the evening for the refugees to attend.
Entertain and enjoy.
Yes.
That's right. Yeah.
And then there were a group of refugees who came to me shortly after I arrived there, and they said, "We are artists.
We are artists.
But we have nothing to pursue our art with. We don't have any materials. Can you get us some materials?" Well, I had no budget for that. Okay, so it had to come out of my own pocket. And I went to Singapore, and I got the materials on one condition.
Yes.
And that was that they would hold art classes in the camp for the refugees.
Okay.
Because art is a way of giving people hope.
Oh.
Okay?
Entertain.
And so that's what they did. they produced their own artworks, and we would have soirees, evenings, little gatherings where their works would be up on the wall, and the foreigners in the camp would buy them.
At the time I saw they have the youth center.
They have a youth center.
Yeah,
yes.
so they use that.
But so that was one of the things that I did, and they would have a 8-week course for refugees.
For refugee, yeah.
And then they would have a graduation, and they'd show what they had done, and so on and so on. So that all worked out very well.
Wow.
And it was we produced a calendar the second year I was there.
Yeah.
Of the students' drawings. A Galang calendar.
Calendar.
Yes, for 1985.
Yes.
And so that was a little bit of a success. Now, the other thing that happened at Galang that I was very heavily involved in was the government started to complain. Too many refugees were staying more than 2 years. They didn't want any refugee to stay more than 2 years. They want refugees to be resettled before that. And because resettlement was the solution for the Vietnamese refugees.
That's right.
So I started what was called the Long Stayers Program.
The long stay program.
Long Stayers Program.
Okay.
And I got several social workers to run that program for me.
Yeah.
Indonesians. And we interviewed and there were over 200 long stayers.
Yeah.
That had been there for more than 2 years. So I and my social workers, but I interviewed every one of them.
Yes.
And found out what their situation was and why they were not being resettled.
Right.
And for most of them, they had not learned English. And they could be, Canada would always accept them if they knew English.
Yeah.
And so we started a special long stayers English language program. We built a separate schoolhouse for it.
Okay.
It was called the Hall of Hope.
A hall of hope.
Hall of Hope.
In Galang 1.
In Galang 2.
Really?
Because all those long stayers
Because
stayed
they
in Galang 2.
Oh, okay. Later they moved them.
They moved them to Galang 2 because they'd been there for so long.
Yeah.
Galang 1 was for the newcomers.
Newcomers, yes.
Excuse me. And so we got them to, we got a lot of them resettled.
Yeah.
Through that program.
Wonderful.
Yes. So that was another big effort. And then there was one wonderful refugee, my good friend. He was eventually resettled in Tasmania, in Australia. And he was concerned about the young men, single young men.
A single young man.
Who had nothing to do in the camp.
Yeah.
And therefore would tend to get in a bit of trouble.
Ah.
And so he started just for them, he started a business making tofu.
Making tofu, yeah?
Yes, in Galang 1.
Yeah.
Whether they were living in Galang 1 or Galang didn't make any difference. If they were young men, single young men, they were eligible to work there. And many of them worked there. And it gave them something to do all day long.
Good, yeah.
Yes.
Just basically
yes,
something to do.
So it was his idea, it wasn't my idea. But I supported him very much.
Good,
and helped him to get a separate building and the instruments that he needed and so on and so on. The machines he needed to make tofu and so on. And of course he's a leader, and so he was resettled. Leaders are taken up by the country. So unfortunately he was resettled, and the program ended when he was resettled because there was no one else around who could take it up. They kept it going for a while, but it wasn't as successful. Excuse me. So these were some of the things that were happening in Galang. And we'd have dances at the youth centers in both Galang 1 and Galang 2.
Yeah.
We would regularly have dances, and I would always attend, make sure everything went okay. Yes, dances for the refugees. Social events where refugees.
That's good. Yeah, some activity. So they
activity. That's right.
That's right.
Right, and we tried to make the place livable for people. That that's part of protection. That's the dignity of the human being. They live a life they're able to live with a little bit of ease, even though they're in a difficult situation.
Mm-hmm.
So yes.
Anything else you still remember about in Galang?
Sometimes my colleagues would kid me because, for example,
Yeah.
the camp commander would send me a refugee husband and wife who were fighting with one another, who were having a tough time with their marriage. And in several cases, I said to them, "Are you a Buddhist or a Catholic or a Kaldai or what?" And usually they said, "We're Buddhists."
Yeah.
I said, "Okay, I'm going to have you meet with your the Buddhist monks and see if you can't get things worked out." And my colleagues always used to kid me about this. Oh, he uses those religious people. But this is true. Dominici, the priest in Galang 1, he often helped people in that way.
Yeah, I remember
Yes.
Dominici.
He often helped people in that way. And so I took a page from his book and followed his example.
Mm-hmm.
And when people were having a tough time, I sent them to the religious leaders to see if they couldn't get some counseling to help them.
Mm.
Or to help them either to get their marriage back together again or to make a decision to split nicely.
Yeah.
Either one, but without violence. I often attended weddings in Galang.
Oh,
Yes. And they were very simple but very wonderful.
okay.
So it was a very difficult job for me, but I tried to enjoy it, and just like Katerina the other night at supper,
Yeah.
who was a Galang refugee, she said, "You know, I didn't remember you until you smiled." This is what she
That's
said.
true, that's true, yeah.
She said, "I didn't remember you until you smiled, and then I remembered you." And I always felt with the refugees from the very first day that they don't need a sad face. They
Yeah.
need a smile.
A smile.
Sometimes with some refugee cases, they were so difficult to solve. The only thing you could give them at the moment was a smile.
Yeah.
And so I always tried to make, to be smiling in the
Smile.
camp.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so it was very interesting when she said, "I didn't remember you until you smiled." Yeah.
That's a good
See, when I
impression.
first went to this is the origin of my refugee work. When I first went to, I was teaching in an international school in Singapore, and we had a request from somebody in Malaysia. The refugees were just starting to come. This was in the beginning of the school year in September of 1977,
Yeah.
which was to be my last year at that school. Anyhow, I was in charge of the social service activity in the school, and we had a request for toys, used clothing, toys, and books for the refugees just coming,
Yeah.
you know, to help them with their life. And so we made the students who were organizing these things gave first priority to the refugees. They had a number of requests, but the top priority was the refugees. And these were all kids from all over the world.
Yeah.
It's an international college. And they took up a collection, huge mound as big as this room of clothes and toys and books. It was amazing.
Really?
And so I found out who it was that had made the request, and I phoned them. And I said, "Hey, I've got all this stuff here." I phoned over to Johor Bahru. It was the Malaysian Red Crescent.
Yeah.
I said, "I've got all this stuff over here. How am I going to get it to you?" And they said, "Don't you worry about that. We'll come and get it."
Okay.
This is the Malaysian Red Crescent. Wonderful people.
Wonderful. Mhm.
"We'll come and get it, but we want you to do something for us." I said, "What's that?" They said, "Our refugees many of them will be going to English-speaking countries. They need to have English classes.
That's right.
So can you come to the camp and help them to get the English classes started?" Well, it was amazing that they were asking me this.
Yeah.
Because I had experience with teaching English as a foreign language
Yeah.
when I was a Peace Corps volunteer, which is how I first came to Asia.
Yeah.
And so I knew how to set up such a course.
Uh-huh.
And so I went on a Saturday. We went in the morning from out to Pulatega in Johor, and I was in the camp for about 4 hours, 4 or 5 hours, from about 10 o'clock to about 2 or 3 in the afternoon. Then we went back. There were about 2,000 refugees in the camp, in buildings built for 600. It was tremendously overcrowded. And just, I had never seen any human situation that was so bad. And so, the whole time I was there, I had to bite my tongue to stop from crying.
Oh.
I had to bite my tongue to stop from crying the whole time. And on during that visit, a local priest, I'm a Catholic, and a local priest came. Lots of the refugees were Catholic at that time.
Yeah.
A local priest came and said mass for the refugees. And I sat way in back and cried through the whole mass. And so it was the day that changed my life. And I cry whenever I think about it. So it was amazing. I just, I just didn't know what to say or what to do. I was just amazing. And so when I left the camp, I made myself 2 promises. Number 1, I would never cry again in the camp. I would smile all the time. Refugees didn't need a long face. They needed a smiling face.
Yeah.
That was one of the promises I made to myself. And the second promise I made to myself was that I would use all my spare time. I was a full-time teacher, but I would use all my spare time on weekends and school holidays to work for them. And so the Malaysian Red Crescent knew I was committed. I told them, I'm going to work, I'm going to come up here regularly. They said, good, we'll get you a Red Crescent card where you'll become a member of us. And in that group that was visiting that day, there was a nun, and there were some Seventh-day Adventist medical doctors. And they were going back to Singapore with me, and they said to me, we can't come up here regularly, but these refugees really need some medicines. They're not getting any medicines. So I said, well, I'm going to be coming up each weekend. So I became a smuggler. I smuggled in medicines to Malaysia from Singapore every weekend from the Seventh-day Adventists. And one of the interesting things was, and I don't like to say this too publicly, but since we're talking about what happened.
Okay.
On the way back on the boat, the nun was reading the list of requests she got from what the refugees needed, baby and powder and so on and so on. And she said, she came to this item, condoms and birth control. And,
really?
and she said, I don't know what they would need those for. So I just kept quiet. And later on I said to the doctors from the Seventh-day Adventists, look, they've asked for condoms and birth control pills. Would you be able to give them? They said, we'll give them box loads.
Box loads?
Yes.
Okay.
And they did, and they gave them to me, and I had to smuggle them into Malaysia. And I got my friends in Singapore to, you take this and I'll take this, and we'll meet at a certain point over. Oh yeah, I became a real smuggler.
Really smart.
Oh yes, and. So
you have to be flexible.
You have to be flexible. The Seventh-day Adventists, I did get a school started there. And the Seventh-day, I would go up every Saturday and I would teach the refugees who could already speak some English. I would teach them how to teach their lessons for the next week. Each Saturday I taught the teachers how to teach their lessons for the next week.
Okay.
This is how I did it. And so it was an amazing experience, just amazing, just amazing. and they kept bodyguard. There were still some naughty young men stealing and so on and so on. So wherever I slept, they would find a space for me to sleep, and then there would be bodyguards around to make sure nobody bothered me. The refugees and we just got along tremendously, just tremendously. And we had to build there was a central little cemented area, and so I got the refugee committee to agree that we would put up 4 classrooms there.
Yeah.
And so that they would have the feel of studying. And I got the wood. I bought it myself, and I got the wood and brought it over in the boat. And they had told me there's one carpenter, refugee carpenter in the camp,
Yeah.
and so he can help me to get this built. And just the walls and seats and so on. Very simple stuff.
Yeah.
And after the wood all arrived, the committee said, the refugee carpenter is still sad from his trip. He doesn't want to work. So I said, okay, I'm going to build it myself. And I started sawing and hammering and so on. And they got all very embarrassed. And the refugee carpenter came and said, I'm sorry, I'll help you. And he built the whole thing.
Good. Yeah.
Oh, it was wonderful.
Yeah.
Yeah, just wonderful.
I just want to make sure that this is still on. Okay. So, I'm interested on after the refugee life. The next thing is about, as you mentioned about religious. First of all, how you become brother Theo?
That's a whole different story.
But because after you involved with the refugee,
I entered a monastery and became a monk.
And the second thing is about you spend time all your life in Asia. So far it's 42 years.
43 years.
43 years.
In
it's
Asia.
In Asia.
I spent 11 years teaching.
Right.
I originally came as a Peace Corps volunteer
to
the island of Borneo and lived in the jungle for 2 years.
It's in the jungle.
Yes. And that was a real wonderful experience. Once I survived in the jungle, I knew I could live any place. Right?
Okay.
So living in a refugee camp was no problem.
That's a good, yeah.
Once I had survived those 2 years in the jungle, I knew I could live.
Wonderful experience, yeah.
Yes, and so I taught for 11 years in Malaysia, Brunei, Thailand, and Singapore.
Right.
And then I got involved with the refugees. Then I went back to the States for 2 years, thinking I would, because I wanted to see my family, and thinking I would never come back to Asia. But then the UN came looking for me.
Oh.
And offered me a job.
You didn't looking for them, but
I had applied to them when I was working for Malaysian Red Crescent.
You did apply,
but they didn't know who I was. They just
screened and they maybe
didn't pay any attention.
Okay.
But then they were looking for somebody to start up a proper education program in Malaysia.
Yeah.
And so they heard about me and the education program I had done at Pulau Tengah, and so they came looking for me.
Wow.
And they interviewed me in New York City, and on the spot gave me a job.
It's just
I was
like
just so happy.
Okay.
Because that's really the work I wanted to do. Because that day that changed my life, I just, ever after then, I was looking for ways to help the refugees. And yes, so I was 8 years with UNHCR. And during the 3rd year, I was in the Philippines, and I was having problems myself. I was living a playboy life. I was working very hard for the refugees, but in my free time, I was a playboy. And then I started going.
Listen, nobody knows that.
And then I started going to church as well.
Okay.
So when you're a playboy and a church person, conflict.
Conflict, yeah.
So I went to a good Vietnamese sister friend, Sister Pascal Leti Trio. I went to her. We worked very closely with the refugees in refugee work, and she's my good friend.
Yeah,
still
Sister
is.
Pascal.
Pascal Leti Trio.
Leti Trio.
I'm still in email contact with her.
Yeah.
Anyhow, I told her, I said, Sister, I have to go away and get myself straightened out. just for a while, just for a few days. And so she's the one who said, "What about this monastery?"
That's in Massachusetts.
No, in,
In
the Philippines.
Sorry,
In the
okay.
Philippines.
Okay, Philippines.
And I said, "Okay, yeah, sure, I'll try that." And so I went to the monastery, and very soon I knew, oh, this is the life I'm supposed to be leading. Okay, I knew it here.
Yeah.
So, but it took me 5 years to find a monastery that would accept me. You know, not every monastery is willing to accept a playboy.
Hmm. So you would say that.
So I was in the monastery. I was accepted in the monastery in Massachusetts. I was there for 5.5 years, and then the monks in Hong Kong, who were all refugees from mainland China.
How did you find out?
Just a minute. Well, we were all in the same
All
order.
the same, okay.
And they sent out a message to every community. Help us. The communists are coming to Hong Kong and we're not getting any new recruits.
Yeah.
We need some help.
Okay.
So I volunteered.
So yeah, in order they know.
And my community in Massachusetts was not happy about it.
Because they want to keep you.
They wanted to keep me.
Yeah.
And so, but anyhow, eventually they let me go. And so I lived there for 19 years in Hong Kong.
Hmm.
And in those 19 years, I included 5 years of teaching university English in mainland China, incognito as a monk. That is, they didn't know I was a monk.
They didn't know.
They might have known. The communists know everything. But
they,
I didn't, I wasn't preaching or anything like that. I was just quiet.
Yeah.
Anyhow, so after 19 years there, our monastery, well, small monastery in Taiwan needed help, so I volunteered to go there. I'm a volunteer.
Always volunteer.
This is my life. My life, I'm a volunteer person. So I volunteered to go to Taiwan, and that's where I am now. Yeah, and that's probably where I will stay until they put me under the ground. Probably.
So you would say that now you are the Catholic monk. That is up there to use, or you choose the way you are symbolized to become the Catholic
I became a Catholic monk because it became clear that that's what the man upstairs wanted.
upstairs, yeah.
Wasn't I did not choose that. Are you serious? I'd never choose that. I did not choose it, but he made it very clear to me that that's what I was supposed to be doing.
Many people in life, they say this is the way. You choose your way. But I think it's
The fact of the matter is, you do choose your way. In many, it varies from situation to situation.
Right.
I always teach my students in my English classes when we talk about fate or destiny.
Yeah.
I give them the example of Dag Hammarskjöld, who was the first Secretary General of the United Nations. Mm-hmm. And after he died, he was not a religious man. But after he died, they found his personal writings, which were very spiritual.
Wow.
And they published them in a book called Markings. When I was a college student, when I walked around the university, I always had markings in my hand. You know, it was my book that accompanied me everywhere, because it was wonderful. And he has something on destiny that I always teach my students. He said, fate is like this. He said, it's like the frame of a picture.
Yes.
You know, you're born at a certain time and into a certain family, in a certain country and culture. This is the frame, the framework.
The framework.
But the kind of picture that ends up in there is your business.
Oh, okay.
The limits are there, the frame.
That's a
where you were born, what year you were born, what family you were born into, etc., etc. But the kind of picture you paint there, that's your life. That's your decision. Mm-hmm. And that always rings a bell with people. You know, that there is an element of fate in everybody's life.
Right.
But within that element, there's a lot of room for different kinds of pictures.
Yes.
Yeah. So, therefore, I'm not going to philosophize about my lifestyle or anything like that. I did what I felt I had to do.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And now, what do monks like me? I'm a contemplative monk. We don't have schools. We don't have parishes. We don't do active preaching.
Yeah.
We are people who pray.
That's why, yeah, a lot of people want to know.
We are
that,
people
yeah.
who pray. And what do we? At the top of my prayer list is always refugees. I try to carry people in prayer.
Mm-hmm.
That's before I tried to carry people in practical ways,
Practical.
in
yeah.
active practical
Now
ways.
it's
I tried to
just-
carry. Now I carry them in prayer.
In prayer.
Yeah. When I was at Galang, especially, when I would come back from the camp, if I had to stay in town, I would come back from the camp in the evening. I'd go to the office to see if anything was important for me to act on. Then I'd go and have my dinner. And then I'd go around to the nuns' convent. They gave me a key for their outside door, which they always kept locked,
That's in Tanjung Pinang.
in Tanjung Pinang.
Right.
And I'd step in to this very dark little church and a little chapel and spend a half hour or so praying for the hard cases, praying for the difficult cases,
Difficult
praying for the refugees who were having troubles,
Mm.
etc., etc.
Yeah.
So I started that carrying kind of thing early on, long before I was a monk.
Ah.
Yeah. Yeah. And the nuns were good to me. They knew that I had to do that.
Mm.
And so it was, and so when I was in Galang, usually we Catholics, if we go to Mass during the day, our Catholic service, we go once a day.
Mm-hmm.
But I was in Galang. Galang 1 church had the Mass in the morning, and Galang 2 church had the Mass in the evening.
So you went.
And when I was in the camp, I went to both.
Oh.
And so when the bishop came, I said, I've been doing something that I'm not supposed to be doing. And he said, what's that? And I said, I go to church and fully participate in the Mass in the morning in Galang 1 and in the evening in Galang 2. I said, I know I'm only supposed to go once a day. He said, nope, that's fine. Don't think a thing about it, just go ahead. Yeah. Yeah. So that was one of my ways of getting to know personally the refugees. There was another element in Galang that did not occur in Malaysia. In the Philippines, of course, there were 2 camps. There was a first asylum camp for the Vietnamese refugees, and then there was the big camp in Bataan, Morone.
That's after they already
the processing
yeah.
for the U.S.
The transit center.
And there were Indo-Chinese refugees, that is Vietnamese, Cambodians, Laos, Laotians. Yes. In Galang, I had a situation which I hadn't dealt with before. And it prepared me to deal with Pakistan a bit. And that is, when I arrived in Galang, there were several hundred Cambodians there.
That's right. Yeah, I remember that.
There were several hundred Cambodians who had come by boat.
Yeah. Or even they crossed the border
And
to
it was
Thailand.
difficult
Yeah.
because they were not treated well by some of the Vietnamese.
Yeah.
So when I found this out, that at nighttime some of them were being nasty, and so someone UN person was always on duty at night, and I told the Cambodian leaders, any problem, call the UN office, and the UN officer will come immediately.
Yes.
And I had to set up that kind of a situation, an organization, so that every evening there would be some UN officer in charge, on duty, all night long.
Yeah.
So that helped a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Yeah. So having to deal with 2 different cultural groups. When I got to Pakistan, amongst the Afghans, there were a dozen different cultural groups.
Wow.
Huge numbers of different cultures. And
it's more complex.
And they were much more complex,
Yeah.
and they were sometimes shooting at each other.
Wow.
And they're not supposed to have guns in refugee camps, but there was a war right next door. It was very, very difficult situation.
Uh-huh.
And right after I got there, there was one refugee was shooting at another one, and thankfully nobody died, but it was a bad situation.
Yes.
And so they were refugees of two different cultural groups.
Yeah.
So I proposed, and they accepted, to the refugees that we have a Quran. They were all Muslims.
Yeah.
That we have a Quran reading competition
Yes.
that everybody would participate in,
Mm-hmm.
so that they would see that they had something in common,
That's right.
that they weren't always different, that they did have something in common.
Mm-hmm.
And we had the Quran reading competition, and I went into my own pocket to get the prizes,
Yeah.
and I was one of the judges inside the mosque.
Yeah.
Yes, and it was a wonderful experience,
Mm-hmm.
and all that sort of stuff stopped a little bit,
Yeah.
because the refugees realized they had this in common,
Mm.
and so they. The fellow who won the contest was blind. He was about in his 40s. He had a beautiful, beautiful voice. Beautiful. And we all agreed,
Uh-huh.
he's the top man. Yes.
That's good.
Beautiful voice. And the second prize went to a young teenage girl who also had a beautiful voice.
Mm.
You know, and a lot of the refugees had hoped that she would win. But the blind man had such a wonderful voice.
So they all agreed for him.
We all agreed, yes.
Good. That's good.
Yeah. So, you know, there are always ways of dealing with problems, but you have to think creatively.
Mm-hmm.
You know, my team, I had a team of that went out to 40 camps together. One Pakistani, one Afghan, and myself, plus our driver, the four of us.
Yeah.
And my two assistants, the Afghan and the Pakistani, they're both Muslim, and they said to me, "You're a Christian. You come here and you decide to have a Quran reading." He said, "We would never have thought of that." You know, you have to think creatively.
Yes.
When you are dealing with human problems, it requires creative thinking.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
That's pretty nice. Very interesting. Wow. So now you live in Taiwan.
That's right. Up in the mountains.
Up to the mountains.
Up in the mountains. Yep.
And you come back to state to visit
Friends and family.
friend and family.
Yep.
And I heard that you have two grandchildren.
I have a son from
A son.
when I was married earlier to a Malaysian Chinese woman, and I have a son, and he's doing very well. Lives in New York, and he has two children. So I have two
Two
grandchildren.
grandchildren.
A grandson 5 and a granddaughter 2,
Uh-huh.
who I have not yet seen. So I will spend most of my time in the States with them.
Okay.
Mm.
That's a wonderful story. Very honored to know you. And
I'm
welcome
just an
you.
ordinary person who believes that people should be treated fairly, no matter who they are, and who believes that there are ways to solve problems. You just have to put your thinking cap on.
Come on.
Okay, yeah. There are ways to solve problems.
I think
Yeah, nobody else would have started art classes, but this was this
Yeah.
would be good for the refugees, you know, and so on. This is what.
I know you. I heard you so many times, and I still keep contact you. But many refugees, they did not have a chance to listen, to know you. So I think this is wonderful that you can tell about your life and your story.
Well, I'm just one person, and there are lots of wonderful people who have done work with refugees. You know, it's not.
Yeah.
I've known some wonderful people. When I first went to work for the UN, my friends in New York said, "You'll never last in the UN." They said, "You're too rebellious, and the UN's a big bureaucracy." So during my first years with UNHCR, I looked very carefully at how the headquarters dealt with the refugees. If I felt that that their main goal was the welfare of the refugees, I decided I would stay with the organization.
Yes.
But if I saw that their main goal was money or, excuse me, something else, I would get to another organization.
Run away.
But I found that their main goal for
Yeah.
the great majority of them was the welfare of the refugees. So I stayed with them.
So especially in the UNHCR staff in Galang, you still keep contact to
Only with a few of them.
just a few of them.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Just if it happens that's the case.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Basically on media connection like
Through Facebook.
email.
Mhm. And I love there were some refugees that I was very close to. Well, there are two of my refugees who translated for me. One lives in British Columbia, near Vancouver,
Yeah.
and the other lives in San Jose. I've been in contact with them, but not recently.
Yeah.
And the one in Canada was embarrassed to show me his picture because he was a young man in his 20s when he was my translator, and now he's a man with white hair. Excuse me.
There one refugee in Galang. He just posted on Facebook this morning. He saw the picture I took with
Yes.
you in '84 and today,
Mhm.
and he say, "How come I am not taller, but I'm even with you?"
Because I have shrunk.
That's why I haven't tell him what will happen, but that's
Yes, I was 5'9.5"
Uh-huh.
most of my adult life, but in the past 10, 15 years, I have shrunk.
So that's
I'm
especially
5'8" now.
answer for Dad in Australia. He's the guy asked me this
Yeah.
morning, Dad.
This happens sometimes when you get older. I mean, I'm 77 years old now.
Yeah.
I'm no longer a young man. I'm still young here in my heart, but not in my body.
And also Venny. Venny is Martin's daughter.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, she
Giovanni.
Giovanni, yeah, she say regard the family, say hi to you.
Mhm.
A lot of friends in Galang, they know. So it's wonderful to know you, Uncle Joe. Thank you very much.
Okay.
And we do it on the iPhone. It's a very
Okay.
simple thing. Thank you.
Okay.
Yes.